There's no question that this period sees the emergence of a larger number of civilization centers and a larger geographical range for civilization than had been true in the classical period. Two developments shape this fact. First, as we already noted, the Mediterranean world splits apart. It wasn't always unified in the classical period, but the Greeks had sketched a considerable effort at unification, at least of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Roman world unified it completely for several centuries. Now it bursts apart, and three related but distinct civilizations begin to emerge from the wreckage of the Roman experiment. There was, first of all, Arabs and Islam. The Middle East and North Africa become the Islamic heartland as well as the heartland of the Arab world, and that's chunk number one. Chunk number two involves the territories carved by the Byzantine Empire in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean and the extensions of Byzantine influence on up to other parts of Eastern Europe. That's chunk number two, deriving from the Mediterranean world. And chunk number three, of course, initially in some disarray, involves the society that would emerge in Italy, north of Italy and France, etc., what we will come to call West European civilization or society. So the Mediterranean divides, and that already adds to the complexity of our civilizational map. But we also have to take account in the post-classical period of the fact that new territories come into the civilization game for the first time. Again, civilization as defined by the capacity to organize states, use writing, develop significant cities, the basic apparatus we've talked about before. This is the period in which Japan enters the history of civilizations. It's the period in which Russia enters. It's the period in which northwestern Europe, northern Germany, the British Isles, although they'd certainly been touched by Rome, Scandinavia certainly, enter the civilizational story. Additional parts of sub-Saharan Africa enter the civilizational story with the great expansion of political activity in West Africa and the stretch of trading territory along the Indian Ocean coast in East Africa. Civilization was not new in sub-Saharan Africa, but the territorial expanse becomes significantly greater. And civilization also expands in this period geographically in the Americas, so that from more confined beginnings in a few parts of the Andes and in Central America, one can begin to talk about major empires, major cultural zones in both of these parts of the Americas. So, splitting of the Mediterranean, geographical expansion of civilization means that the complexity of our story inevitably deepens in one crucial respect. And with it, although we'll touch on this more fully later on, with it comes some new challenges to defining how many civilizations there are. And for example, in dealing with Japan or Russia, or even in a certain respect, the West itself, new kinds of definitional issues will have to mark our discussion that were not so clearly present when we talked about the classical world. Having said this, however, it is important to insist that two basic themes underwrite the post-classical period. Saying two risks oversimplification. There was a lot going on, and we will capture some developments outside these themes. But as opposed to the incoherence and sheer variety that may seem to dominate this period, two basic themes serve as primary focal points. Theme number one, which we'll talk about in greater detail in our next session, theme number one involves the spread of the world religions. That is, the spread of religions that showed the capacity to pour across political and previous cultural boundaries without necessarily erasing these boundaries. These world religions, and there were three of them that were primary, Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. These world religions, one of them quite old, one of them predating this period, one of them born with the period itself, these three religions would push so far into the civilized regions of Afro-Eurasia as to touch literally every major society. They would push so far that literally hundreds of thousands of people, at some point during the post-classical period. More of them in the first half than the second, but the process was ongoing. Hundreds of thousands of people would change their belief systems, not necessarily completely, but would alter their focus because of a conversion to one of these three basic faiths, a process that frankly is fairly rare in human history at this scale. So point number one, obviously, the post-classical period, as we look at it throughout the Afro-Eurasian world, the post-classical period is partly defined, partly given coherence by the immense surge of missionary religions, mainly originating either in the Middle East or in India, but spreading from these places to the other parts of Asia, to much of Africa, and to ultimately pretty much the whole of Europe. A huge process. This focus on cultural developments, that is, changes in beliefs and values and the attendant shifts in art and other cultural activities. These changes in cultural focus also help explain, although again you could have a chicken and egg discussion here, they also help explain why the post-classical period is not defined by overarching political themes. There are important political developments in Japan, in Western Europe, in the Arab world certainly, but unlike the classical period when we could talk about the common tendency, at least periodically, to form empires, there's no clear pattern at all in this period. There are some important empires headed by China. The Arab Caliphate is an empire of sorts, but there are places in which decentralized rule predominates. There are places in which efforts to form empire clearly occur, but equally clearly fail. We will have to pay attention to politics, but there's no political theme, and this is partly because people's attention, their capacity to innovate, their focus on institutional creation, and no small amount of their money went to religion. And the churches and the networks of Islamic legal centers and centers of scholarship, the Buddhist temples, these become the focus of activity in this period in a way that often eclipses the role of formal states themselves. So, cultural theme with the subsidiary statement that politics, while it doesn't disappear, stops organizing world history more generally for this span. The second theme, equally striking, probably in the long run more important. The second theme involves the emergence of what I like to call a world network. And I use the term only to try to convey that it's in this period that systematic commercial and through commerce other kinds of exchanges begin to predominate in much of the Afro-Eurasian world, as opposed to the less systematic, less significant patterns of exchange that we had described in the classical world, along with concepts such as the Silk Road and that sort of thing. During the post-classical period, a basic commercial artery emerges in the Indian Ocean, running from the Middle East with Arab and Persian and other traders operating the system from that end, emerges from the Middle East, across the Indian Ocean, obviously to India and Sri Lanka, but also reaching Southeast Asia, both the landmass and the Indonesian islands, reaching around into the Pacific, touching the Philippines, and reaching the Pacific coast of China. So an east-west or a west-east artery was the fundamental unit of trade and communication.